Go back that far.
Well, why don't we get started? Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to see students joining us today, as well as the faculty and interested friends from the community. This is the Tower Center monthly seminar, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Jim Garand from LSU to discuss his work on immigration, which is certainly a hot-button issue in this campaign season, this election year. Immigration is always a controversial issue, and it's good that we have solid research behind these questions so that it doesn't get caught up in emotions and in slogans. I can think of nobody better to discuss this than our speaker today. His full bio is in front of you, so I won't read it all. You can take a look at it, but suffice to say he really is one of the leaders in American politics and immigration studies for a long time. Professor Garand will speak for 40 minutes?
45 minutes.
45 minutes about, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Professor Garand.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to speak here today at the Tower Center. I've never been to this campus, so it's great to see this beautiful campus on a beautiful day, and I appreciate you coming when you could be outside enjoying the beautiful day. So let me see if we can move along here. What I'm going to talk to you today about is how we think about documented immigrants and how we think about undocumented immigrants, and the implications for how we think about those two groups for how we think about immigration policy. I have some research collaborators on this project. Liz LeBron's a doctoral student of mine at LSU. Bettina Wilkinson's an assistant professor at Wake Forest and is a former doctoral student of mine. And Tom Holbrook is an old friend from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to start off by talking about how Americans think about documented and undocumented immigrants. This is actually something I haven't seen a whole lot of in the literature. We see a lot of people ask questions about how Americans think about undocumented immigrants, but we really don't have this comparison point. And so we're going to spend some time laying out some general descriptions of how Americans see those two groups. Then I want to talk about how we explain why some Americans like those two groups and other Americans don't like those two groups. And then third, I'm going to look at how Americans thinking about documented and undocumented immigrants shapes how they think about immigration policy. Okay, so it'd be nice if people just had attitudes towards documented and undocumented immigrants, but it didn't matter. But in fact, I think it does matter, and I'm going to show you that it actually does. Immigration is a terribly controversial topic. For many years, well before I was born, there were debates about nativism in the United States. But my earliest recollection of really intense debates, my earliest recollection as a young adult, were debates surrounding the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which passed in 1986. This act granted legal status to undocumented immigrants who had been in the United States before January 1st, 1982. This act was very controversial at the time because it was viewed as granting to undocumented or quote-unquote illegal immigrants, granting them amnesty, and so there was a huge debate about that. Since then, one of the concerns was that granting amnesty to undocumented immigrants would have the effect of increasing the number of undocumented immigrants. And in fact, we did see increases in both documented and undocumented immigrants in the years since 1985, since 86, which I'll show you in just a minute. Some of you may remember that there were some immigration reform protests in some of the major cities in the United States, most notably in Los Angeles and Chicago and some other cities that generated a lot of protests where immigrants were protesting some of the efforts to try to remove undocumented immigrants from the United States. And some of you may also be familiar with efforts to try to build a fence along the U.S.-Mexico border, which was authorized by the Secure Fence Act in 2006. Obviously, that's a controversial act. And then finally, if anyone is paying any attention at all to the 2016 presidential election, you can't go without hearing about some of the controversial immigration arguments that are made. In particular, you see Donald Trump has offered a bunch of interesting ideas. And then also there's a debate about some of the other presidential candidates, in particular Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush, and some of the others, Ted Cruz, over whether they support a pathway to citizenship versus legal status but no citizenship versus, in the case of Donald Trump, deportation. So what we're talking about here is a really controversial issue in American politics. Well, let me start off. You'll find that I'm a data-driven political scientist. I do a lot of quantitative data analysis, so I'm going to show you a lot of figures like this in this presentation, which I think tell a story about how we think about immigration. The first thing I want to show you are trends in the foreign-born population in the United States since 1850. And you can see during this time period over here, we had between 10 and 15% of the American public was born outside of the United States. And you're thinking, most of us would think about the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was a large influx of immigrants. And then over the years after the 1930s, we saw this precipitous decline in the foreign-born population until we got into the 1960s and 1970s when the foreign-born population was about 5%. Well, since then, we've seen this very rapid increase in the foreign-born population. And you could, someone who studies politics, when you bring people together who aren't always exactly the same, sometimes conflict results. And so you can understand why there might be some controversy that surrounds the introduction of a large number of immigrants during this time period. Many of those immigrants are documented, but there's also been an increase in the undocumented population. There we go. And so this shows you trends in the undocumented immigrant population since 1990, and you can see it. We don't have dependable data before then, or very good data before then. So you can see in 1990 we had about 3.5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. It rose to about 12.2. I think that's 2007, and then it flattened out in the low 11 million range. I just saw recently that last year the undocumented population dropped just below 11 million. I think it's like 10.9 million. That's not reflected here. And what happened here is we saw the great economic recession here, which may have discouraged some undocumented immigrants to come to the United States, or some people to come without documentation. So that gives you some background. But what do we know so far about how Americans think about immigrants? Well, typically, survey researchers ask questions about how Americans think about immigration in general. Usually these questions are something like, do you support increases in the number of immigrants in the United States, decreases in the number of immigrants, or keeping immigration the same? And so these are data from the American National Election Survey, which is a data set that we use in political science. And you can see that there's a little bit of fluctuation over time, but the fluctuation is not what's important. What's important is that the plurality position is almost always people support a decrease in immigration. There's also a fairly large number, but not as many. There's a fairly large number of Americans who think we should keep immigration where it is. And then the number, or the percentage of people who think we should increase immigration, while it's increasing slightly over time, it's still well under 20%. So we see this pattern of most Americans either say, let's keep immigration the way it is, or actually let's decrease it. And here are some, I've stolen this slide from the Pew Research Center. This shows the latest data. The data I just showed you goes through 2012. And here's some data that includes data from 2015, and you can see 15% of people think we should increase immigration, 49% think we should decrease it, and 34% think we should keep it as it is. So I think it's fair to say that a good number of Americans think we should actually decrease immigration, and there's some people who think we should keep it the same, but not many people think we should increase it. Why would Americans be concerned about immigration? Well, there's a debate about whether immigration has a positive effect or a negative effect. I think historically most people view it as having a positive effect, but in today's context, if you ask people about how they think about current immigration, about a slight majority of Americans think that immigration actually strengthens the United States, while about 40% of Americans think that immigration, 41% think that it's actually a burden. Now, what about how Americans think about undocumented immigrants? Okay? By the way, you notice I haven't shown you anything about how Americans think about documented immigrants, because, frankly, there's not very much until what you're going to see today. But we have seen some questions where people were asked about how they think about undocumented immigrants. And here I'm showing you the trends for the American National Election Study. This is what's called a feeling thermometer. A feeling thermometer is a question we ask in surveys that range from 0 to 100. 0 means you don't like a group. 100 means you love the group, and 50 means you feel neutrally. Okay? So here is the neutral line, right here. This is 50. And anything below that would mean that you have negative attitudes towards a particular group. And you can see, on average, Americans have negative views towards undocumented immigrants. I think the question is actually refers to illegal immigrants in the survey, but you can see there's no positive view toward that group. Then one of the questions is, what should we do with undocumented immigrants? And this is where there's a lot of argument about this. These are Pew Research Center data from 2015. 74% of Americans say undocumented immigrants should be able to stay in the United States. 24% of Americans think that undocumented immigrants should be not allowed to stay illegally. I assume that means they should be deported. But among this 74% group, there's a difference of opinion about whether undocumented immigrants should have a pathway to citizenship. And so you can see 47 out of the 74 think that we should have a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. But 24% say no, there should be no citizenship, but we should let undocumented immigrants stay in the United States. And if you add these two together, it's 48% who think there should not be a pathway to citizenship and 47% who think there should. No surprise, Americans are divided on the issue of immigration. Are you shocked to hear that? Okay, here's the problem that our research is trying to look at. I've just shown you some survey items where we ask people about undocumented immigrants. I've shown you some survey items where we ask people questions about general immigration. But we do not know a whole lot about how Americans think of documented immigrants versus how they think about undocumented immigrants. And in most survey data sets, we ask about either general immigration or we ask about undocumented immigrants, but there's very little that's been done in asking people about documented immigrants. And this really gets to the core of what it is when we think about immigration policy. There are some observers who take the view that Americans just have a general hostility to immigrants in general. And I'm not saying that there aren't Americans who have a general hostility to immigration. In fact, looking at the data, I can see that there are some. But it may be that Americans think differently about legal status versus non-legal status. And so what we do is we try to solve this problem by adding some questions to a survey that permit us to look at documented and undocumented immigrants. Well, who cares? I mean, I say this to my students all the time when we're talking about something having to do with political science. Why is this an important thing? Well, we don't know very much about how Americans view those two groups. We don't know very much about what explains why some Americans like and dislike documented immigrants and some other Americans like and dislike undocumented immigrants. We don't know much about that. If the same things are driving how we think about both groups, well, then that tells us something different than if we find that there are some things that drive how we think about documented immigrants, but there are other things that drive how we think about undocumented immigrants. And then finally, we don't know anything that I've seen about how we view documented and undocumented immigrants and how that shapes how we support or oppose immigration policies. So that's what we're going to be trying to do here. So what do? Well, my friend Tom Holbrook and I put together a survey from the using the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. This is an omnibus survey where they make questions available to everybody, but then everyone can put in a few questions. And so Holbrook and I put some questions in dealing with a bunch of topics, but one of them was immigration. And we included new questions. We asked people about we asked them feeling thermometer questions about how they thought about documented and undocumented immigrants, as well as blacks, whites, Latinos, and Asians. We also asked questions that I have never seen before asked, in which we asked people to place these various groups in terms of their perceived ideology. So what we did is we said, okay, if 0 means that a group is dominated by people who are really liberal, and 100 means that this group is dominated by people who are very conservative, and 50 means they're dominated by people who are moderate, where do you place African Americans? Where do you place documented immigrants or undocumented immigrants? So we get a measure of how liberal or conservative groups think, how liberal or conservative Americans think documented and undocumented immigrants are. And that could be really important, because if I'm a conservative and I give myself a 90, but I perceive undocumented immigrants are a 10, then what I'm saying is I think undocumented immigrants are not like me politically, ideologically, and that might provide ammunition for me to develop negative views towards undocumented immigrants. It's possible. That's what we're trying to explore. And then we asked a whole bunch of questions dealing with immigration policy positions. Oops. Got something here. Let's see. Let's see. There you go. Okay, there we go. All right. So here's where the rubber starts to hit the road. This shows you the distribution of how Americans think about documented and undocumented immigrants. This thick line right here shows us the feeling thermometer scores for documented immigrants. If you give a score over here, that means I really like documented immigrants. If you give a score down here, it means I really don't like that group. You can see, and here's 50. This is the neutral point right here. You can see most Americans are on the positive side of the feeling thermometer with regard to how they think about documented immigrants. There are some Americans who do not like documented immigrants, but it's a relatively small number of Americans. Compare and contrast that to the dashed line, which shows you the distribution of opinion that Americans have about undocumented immigrants. And you can see there is a substantial difference in these two groups. Americans, on balance, most Americans place undocumented immigrants over on this less than 50 mark, which means most Americans express negative feelings toward undocumented immigrants, while at the same time, Americans are expressing positive views towards documented immigrants. This seems to suggest that Americans think about these two groups very differently. Now, is it shocking to me that this is the case? No, I don't pretend that this would be shocking. But there are some concerns that many Americans are just opposed to immigrants completely, and I don't think that this picture here really supports that view. Let's see. Okay. Here is a graph that shows the difference in those feeling thermometers. What I did is I took the documented feeling thermometer and I subtracted the undocumented from it. So that means it's a positive score means you like documented people more than undocumented people. A negative score would mean the opposite. And a 0 would mean you feel the same about both groups. And you can see most people like documented immigrants much better than they like undocumented immigrants. This is a figure that shows how liberal and conservative Americans view documented and undocumented immigrants. The thick black line shows us how Americans on a liberal conservative scale view documented immigrants. Remember, I perceive documented immigrants are conservative. I perceive documented immigrants are liberal. And you can see the distribution is centered around 50. Americans view documented immigrants as being fairly moderate on average. In fact, the average is about 47. So that Americans view documented immigrants as just slightly left of center in their ideological positions. Look at undocumented immigrants, which is the green dashed line. You can see that a large number of Americans view undocumented immigrants as being farther to the left, and in fact their average score is 34, which is several points, 16 points, to the left of the moderate position. So Americans appear to think of documented immigrants as fairly moderate, but they appear to tend to think of undocumented immigrants as being to the left. Now, you know, if you're a liberal person, then you're thinking to yourself, undocumented immigrants are like me. If you're a conservative person, you may think, undocumented immigrants are politically not like me. And so you can see that this might be a basis for some hostility or for some negative view. Now, so what I'm going to try to do now is describe some of the analysis that we've done to try to understand why some people like documented immigrants and others don't, and why some people like undocumented immigrants and others don't. And there are a bunch of different explanations for that. And I'm not going to belabor this, I'm just going to go over this quickly. And this is going to be the basis for a statistical analysis that I have done, which I'm going to flash that up on the screen just so that you can see that I did it, but then I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to show you some figures because we want to make sure we can see what's going on rather than look at all these numbers. So I'm going to pretend that stuff exists. So why should people vary in their views? Well, one thing that could explain it is people's political attitudes, like partisanship or ideology, or are you a Tea Party member? We might suspect that Republicans and conservatives and Tea Party members will be less favorable toward both immigrant groups than Democrats, liberals, and non-Tea Party members. In addition, we look at differences in ideological and policy placement. So here's what I do. I asked every respondent, or Holbrook and I asked every respondent to place themselves on the 0 to 100 scale. And then we asked them to place undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants. And then we measured how far apart they were. So if I give a 90 for my own self-placement, but I give documented immigrants a 50, I'm 40 points away from them. If I give myself an 80 and I give documented immigrants a 75, well, I'm very close. And so I would expect the first person to be more hostile to documented immigrants than the second. And so we are going to test that. And I'm going to show you that there's some evidence to suggest that this is at least partly a basis for opposition to those two groups. A couple of other reasons why people may support immigration in one way or the other involve security, economic security, or international security. A lot of people may be concerned about whether or not having uncontrolled borders may create a security risk. And so we measure some variables that relate to the degree to which people are concerned about international security. But also, there's a lot of debate about whether immigrants coming into the United States are taking American jobs or are lowering wages in particular sectors of the economy. And so we measure some economic evaluations to see whether people who have levels of economic insecurity are more or less likely to support documented and undocumented immigrants. We also ask about certain racial and ethnic groups. Americans perceive that documented and undocumented immigrants are comprised of certain racial and ethnic groups. So, for instance, a large percentage of immigrants in the United States are Hispanic. A number of immigrants in the United States are Asian. So we actually ask people about how they think about Asians and how they think about Hispanics, which are two groups that are linked to immigration, to see if that actually shapes how they think about immigration. And then we also ask people about their nativity status. Were they born in another country? Were their parents born in another country? Were their grandparents born in another country? To see if in fact that's related as well. And then finally, we included some demographic variables which, just are primarily controls, but I'll show you a little bit about that. All right, so what method did we use here? We did the survey of 1,300 respondents. I estimated a series of statistical models, which you don't necessarily care about, but the results that I'll show will reflect that. And then our goal is to explore whether there are similarities or differences in the determinants of how Americans think about documented immigrants and how they think about undocumented immigrants. Okay? So let's look at our findings. Our findings, there's the statistical stuff. We don't need to see that, do we? If anyone's interested, I can show you that during the Q&A period. Here's how I present these results. I present these results in a series of graphs that look like this, okay? And so here, to start off, I look at partisan identification. Here are people who are strong Democrats. Here are people who are strong Republicans. And so I look at, as you become more Republican, what happens to how you think about documented or undocumented immigrants? And of course, this is the feeling thermometer for those two groups. Notice as you become more Republican, you actually become slightly more supportive of documented immigrants. Republicans appear, on average, to give a slightly higher score to documented immigrants than do Democrats. But this is not a statistically significant difference. Here we see, as you become more Republican, you become less supportive of undocumented immigrants. Is it a huge effect? No, it's about a 7-point shift as you move from being a strong Democrat to a strong Republican. Not a huge effect, but it is an effect, and it is statistically significant. Where we really see an interesting effect, sorry, here, we're on partisan. Here we go. This is the absolute ideological distance between a person and where they perceive documented and undocumented immigrants. These are people who see there's no difference between their ideological positions and those of documented and undocumented immigrants. These are people who are the farthest away. What happens as you become farther away ideologically from these groups? Your support for those groups starts to decline. Notice this downward trend. So as you become farther away from documented immigrants, as you start to see them as being different than you become less supportive of documented immigrants. It's a drop of about 12 points. It's even a stronger effect for undocumented immigrants. You drop about 20 points as you move from being similar to undocumented immigrants to being very different from undocumented immigrants. Okay? Here is, I'm not going to go through every one of these in detail. Here's national economy in the past year. If you think the national economy has gotten better, you're more likely to support both documented and undocumented immigrants. It looks like the effect is about the same for both groups. This is for household income. If you think your household income has gotten better in the last year, you are more supportive of undocumented immigrants. But these are the people who feel economic vulnerability. These are the people who feel that their household income has gotten worse in the last year. Notice they are less supportive of undocumented immigrants. But this has no effect on documented immigrants. Economic insecurity, appears to not influence how we think about documented immigrants, but it has a modest effect on how we think about undocumented immigrants. This is support for defense spending, which is a measure of feelings of insecurity. Does not have an effect on documented immigrants, but does have an effect on undocumented immigrants. Again, not a strong effect, but it is one nonetheless. Then this is education, which has an effect on both groups. The more educated you are, the more you like the two groups. By the way, let me take one time out. Notice in every one of these graphs, people like documented immigrants more than they like undocumented immigrants. So there's a clear-cut difference in how we think about those two groups. Then here is where we get something very interesting. This is how Americans think about Hispanics. The more you like Hispanics, the more you like both groups. The more you like Hispanics, the more you like most groups. What that tells me is that Americans in their minds connect Hispanics with both documented and undocumented immigration. But look at this. This is how Americans think about Asians. The more you like Asians, the more likely you support documented immigration. But how you think about Asians has no effect on how you think about undocumented immigrants. What that says to me, says to us, is that Americans somehow connect Asians to documented immigration, but they don't connect Asians to undocumented immigration. To me, this is telling us a lot about how Americans think about these documented and undocumented groups. Okay. Now, so what? What does this matter? Well, so I've demonstrated to you there's some variables that are related to how we think about documented and undocumented immigration, but does this affect policy positions that people have? We included in our survey 5 items that relate to people's attitudes towards immigration policy. And you can see those items here. In addition, we took those 5 items and we created a combined scale that we call the Immigration Policy Conservatism Scale, or something like that. So basically, a high score on that scale means that you're in favor of restricted immigration, whereas a low score means that you are in favor of expanded immigration. Okay, and each one of these items is coded so that a high score means you are in favor of restrictions on immigration or on immigrants in some way. So what we do, here's a graph that shows, here's the feeling thermometer for undocumented and documented immigrants, and then here's the scale of how we think about immigration policy. So a high score would mean we should have a lot of restrictions on immigration. A low score is that we should have free immigration. Okay? If you look at documented immigrants, that's this solid black line, there's a little bit of a decline. As you start to like documented immigrants, you become a little bit less supportive of restrictions. But it's not that strong of an effect. But look at the undocumented group. As you like undocumented immigrants more, you decrease your support for restrictive immigration policy considerably. The people who really want restrictions on immigration policy are people who score on the low end of their views towards undocumented immigration. So undocumented immigrants, how we think about undocumented immigrants, really appears to be the driver for how we think about immigration policies. And I'll tell you that this shows up for all the other items. Remember, there are 5 items. Here is how do we think about opposition to legal status for undocumented immigrants. You can see very strong effect of how we think about undocumented immigrants on this immigration policy, but not a very strong effect for documented immigrants. Same thing, this is on support for increasing the number of border patrols. Same thing for allowing police to question potential undocumented immigrants. Same thing for fines for businesses that hire undocumented immigrants. And the same thing, this is where it's really strong, the same thing for support for identifying and deporting undocumented immigrants. The more you like documented immigrants, it has very little effect on how you think about deportation. But how you think about undocumented immigrants has a very powerful effect on how you think about deportation. In fact, this number, 0.84, 84% of people who very much dislike immigration, undocumented immigrants, 84% support deportation, identifying and deporting, whereas only 14% of people who have the most positive views of undocumented immigrants hold the same view. So there's really quite a difference there in how Americans think about this. All right, I know I'm almost getting close to being out of time, so let me sort of bring this all together, summarize it. And I'm looking forward to comments and suggestions about this work. First, what can we say about Americans' views towards documented and undocumented immigrants? Americans think differently about these two groups. There has been some commentary to suggest that Americans actually think the same negatively. Many Americans think the same negatively about these two groups. That doesn't appear to be supported by the data. There are some Americans who don't like either group. But for the most part, it appears that Americans differentiate people based on their legal status in their minds. Okay? Legal status appears to matter. Okay? Secondly, Americans think of the ideological positions of these two groups very differently. Well, very differently, somewhat differently. Americans tend to view documented immigrants as being fairly moderate. Okay? They tend to view undocumented immigrants as being liberal. If I'm a conservative or if I'm a moderate, it becomes very easy for me to oppose undocumented immigrants because they are politically different than I am. To just sort of make up a story, I can imagine someone saying, well, if we bring all these undocumented immigrants into the United States, it's going to change the ideological makeup of our electorate, and it's going to change things dramatically. So it appears that that is a driver, at least partially a driver, in how we think about these groups. When we try to explain how Americans think about those two groups, we find that some variables have similar effects. So for instance, how far you are from the group ideologically appears to influence how we think about both documented and undocumented. The effect is stronger for undocumented, but it's still a very strong effect for both groups. How we think about the national economy appears to affect both groups the same way. How we are educated. Educated people like both groups more than people with low levels of education. Feeling thermometers towards Hispanics. How Americans think about Hispanics has a similar effect on how we think about documented and undocumented immigrants. But there are some key variables that have different effects. It didn't work. There we go. Here's some key variables that have different effects. Party identification only has an effect on how we think about undocumented immigration, but not documented immigration. Republicans are less positive towards undocumented immigrants than they are toward documented immigrants, let me rephrase that. Republicans are less supportive of undocumented immigrants than Democrats are, but it appears for documented immigrants there's really no difference, and if anything, Republicans like documented immigrants more than Democrats do. Perceived increases in household income only affects undocumented immigrants. What that tells me is that Americans link economic insecurity to undocumented immigrants, but not to documented immigrants. Actually, I'm a little surprised by that because there's a lot of debate about immigration policy relating to bringing documented workers into the United States, and many of the criticisms of that are that it will take jobs. For instance, people who want to bring high-skilled, documented immigrants into the United States, there's a lot of argument about, well, that's going to affect the labor market for people in high-skilled jobs. So I was a little surprised that doesn't work, but apparently it does not work for documented immigrants, but it does have an effect on how people think about undocumented immigrants. Security considerations only have an effect on how we think about undocumented immigrants and not documented immigrants. How we think about Asians, this is really fascinating to me, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this. How you think about Asians, if you like Asians, you like documented immigration. If you like Asians or don't like Asians, it has no effect on how you think about undocumented immigration. That tells me that Americans somehow connect Asians to documented immigration. I haven't seen numbers about the percentage of Asians who are undocumented, so I have to admit that's where we need to head next to see what that looks like. But that to me is a very interesting finding. And then I didn't point this out in the earlier part, but nativity has an effect, but it's a different effect. So people who were born in another country apparently have more positive views towards undocumented immigrants, but not documented immigrants, which I find very fascinating. There is an effect, but it's so small it's not statistically significant. But people whose parents or grandparents were born in another country, that has an effect on how they think about documented immigrants, but not undocumented immigrants. Matthew and I were talking about this. I'm a second generation. My father was born in the United States, but my grandparents were born in French-speaking Canada. And, I think about my family roots, but it's really not an integral part of that. And so there may be something that's going on with regard to that. Then, what about how Americans think about immigration policy? Clearly, how we think about undocumented immigrants is a much stronger predictor, much stronger driver of how we think about immigration policies than how we think about documented immigrants. So if we're trying to get a handle on understanding how Americans think about immigration policies, it's very important for us to focus at least some attention on this difference between documented and undocumented immigrants. And then, so there's that little summary there. And then finally, where do we go from here? This is part of a large-scale research project. I've got several projects dealing with immigration right now, and one of them, I just published a paper with Ping Zhu, who's a former doctoral student of mine now at University of Rhode Island, and Belinda Davis, who's a colleague of mine. We just published a paper in the American Journal of Political Science, where we look at how Americans think about immigration as it relates to how Americans think about welfare. And what we find is that how Americans who have positive views towards immigration have much more positive views towards welfare spending and welfare expansion, which tells us that people who don't like immigration or immigrants, people who are less positive, have less positive views towards welfare. And this prompts us to describe what we call the immigrationalization of welfare policy in the United States, and I'm working on several papers about that. But one of the interesting things that we've not looked at is the degree to which this immigrationalization of welfare, how we think about welfare, may be due to the difference between how we think about documented and undocumented immigrants. And I will tell you, I didn't put this up here, but I've done some preliminary analyses, and how we think about undocumented immigrants has a much stronger effect on how we think about welfare than how we think about documented immigrants. So this immigrationalization of welfare that we're talking about may actually be really limited, or at least driven largely by how we think about undocumented immigrants. And then finally, I'm very interested in the role of race and ethnicity and how we think about these matters. There are groups in the United States that have had histories of discrimination and exclusion. And so one of the questions is, are groups such as African Americans, do they connect how they think about documented and undocumented immigrants to their immigration feelings? Do they do that differently than, say, whites do, or other groups? So that's something that we're going to explore at some point in the future. With that, I thank you for taking the time away from this beautiful day to listen to what I have to say, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you for a marvelous talk, first of all. Thank you also for your flexibility, as our clicker appears to have died about your second or third slide. You were seamless. What a pro. I'll take questions, and I'll keep the cube here, but I'll take the prerogative too. How important is immigration policy on how people vote? I mean, you're interested ultimately in how this translates into policy.
Right.
How salient is this for most voters?
We have not looked at this yet. It is a salient issue, but this is, part of the problem is that the data that we use is from the 2014 Congressional Election Survey, which means we might be able to study how people voted in congressional races in 2014. And we do have data about voting behavior, which we have not explored yet. But what we're trying to do is we just submitted a proposal to the American National Election Survey, which who knows whether it will be accepted, but to ask these same kinds of questions when they conduct their 2016 ANES survey, so that we would then be able to see, particularly in a presidential race where immigration was such a key, or has been such a key issue, and I suspect will continue to be a key issue. So the answer is it's undetermined yet, but it definitely is on the research agenda, and it's a very important question, particularly in the 2016 presidential election.
So, Eileen?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. When I see your graphs, really what pops out for me is sort of a story about ethnicity and a story about anti-Latino sentiment. So to what extent have you thought that really this difference that you're capturing between documented and undocumented immigrants is tied to sort of a seemingly race-neutral way to express anti-Latino sentiment, right? That when you pose that people are sort of making that distinction.
Right.
And then, I guess, on a related point to that, in the survey, because you're asking people to express feelings about undocumented immigrants or documented immigrants and Latinos. What is the order of these questions, right? Because it would seem to me that if you ask questions to say, how do you feel about undocumented immigrants, and then the following questions are documented, that sort of would really highlight the difference. Whereas if the first question were documented, then that could be a little bit more muddy.
Well, first, two great questions. Let me take the second one first. We actually randomly assigned the question ordering. We wanted to be very careful to ask the CCES people to randomly assign them because we didn't want to connect the responses so that people would say, oh, well, here's my answer to undocumented, well, now let me answer my documented question. And your first question dealt with whether this has an effect on how we think about Latinos, and you can see from that one graph where we look at how Americans think about Hispanics, which is the word used in the survey, which is why I use that phrase. And you can see that has, I can pull that slide up, it has a very strong positive effect on how we think about both groups. And what that says to me is that in the minds of Americans, when they hear the word immigration or immigrant, there's at least some element where they think about Latinos. And of course, there are many more immigrants in the United States that are not Latino too. So one of the future research ideas that I think has to be considered is to look at where people get these ideas about connecting Latino status and, say, immigration. And I think one of the possible sources for this is in how the media covers these stories. For instance, I have a colleague who's done some work on this, looking at the media coverage of immigration. And so if you think about immigration stories, and you think about maybe its connection to security, for instance, think about the number of stories we see where someone is illegally crossing the Rio Grande River, and that sort of conjures up these images of some kind of security issue, as opposed to maybe covering undocumented immigrants in a way that covers other aspects of their lives. So I think that you are onto something, that there may be some connection, and we're trying to look at it by looking at how Americans think about Latinos and Asians and see if that's connected to how they think about
And even the economic question, because of racialized stereotypes of how Latinos use welfare or social services, the fact that undocumented immigrants are sort of predicting at this over.
Yes. See, in the paper, we have another paper that we've just finished in which we actually look at immigrant welfare rates in the home states that people live, and we find that those people who live in states where there's a relatively high immigrant welfare use, we unfortunately can't distinguish between Latino or Asian or other ethnic group welfare use, but where we find there's high welfare use, the connection between how Americans think about immigration and how they think about welfare is much stronger than in states where immigrants have relatively low welfare usages. So that paper's coming out, and we just haven't submitted it yet.
I should mention on this question of the media and immigration coverage, the Tower Center is going to be hosting an event on the evening of March 14th called Immigration in the News, How the Media Covers the Issue and How the Public Responds, featuring Eileen Cardona and Julian Aguilar of the Texas Tribune. So if you want to dig deeper in that issue, the evening of March 14th, we'll cover it in much more depth.
Well, part of this work is inspired by a book that was written a number of years ago, maybe 15 years ago, by a guy named Martin Gillens, who he wrote a book called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And his basic argument was that how Americans think about welfare is really driven by race. How Americans think about African Americans is related to how they think about welfare. And the reason that Gillens makes that connection is he demonstrates, looking at media coverage, that many of the stories about welfare policy in the United States, many of the news stories, have African American faces in them. And so Americans who are just looking at the media, that's where they're getting their information, right? Or much of their information. If they're thinking about immigration, if they're thinking about welfare, they're seeing African American faces. And so Gillens was arguing there are more African American faces in those stories than there are African Americans on welfare. And so the same thing may be going on here. But unfortunately, we don't have the data here. This is kind of the start of this research agenda.
So I said, Tony Garand?
Yeah, please. In your surveys, I'm wondering whether or not people assume that documented immigrants have higher levels of education, maybe higher levels of ability to contribute to the economy, and that undocumented don't.
Cal, that's a great point. One of the things that I'm interested in is how Americans view various groups. Okay, in fact, you notice I included some questions about African Americans and Asians and Hispanics. This is kind of a start. So what we did is we asked about whether you like those groups or not, but we also asked, are they more liberal or conservative? We also asked whether they're more Republican or Democrat. But what you're getting at is a completely different thing, which is people's perceptions of the degree to which immigrants of different documentation statuses, whether or not they contribute differently, they have different education levels, etc. And I've not seen any survey items that ask that. And so, I mean, that's a great idea to include the next time we have a chance to do a survey. Because I think that that's part of what's going on here.
Next on my list was Hiroki.
Yeah, this was great talk and very informative, and I learned a lot. One question is policy implication of your finding of the public attitude towards the immigration policy.
Right.
It seems to me that the one policy implication is policy should not be made based on the public attitudes toward immigration, because public usually does not understand the economic rationale of the immigration policy.
Right.
And one example is in Texas, undocumented children of undocumented immigrants can be given residential status.
Right.
And then they can go to state university with a residential status. And then idea is economic rationale is if they do not go to the college, they will not pay more tax, or they will receive receive the social welfare benefits. So it makes sense, but when it seems to me that from your findings suggest that public does not take into consideration the economic rationale, it seems that the conclusion is one policy implication is immigration policy should not be made based on the public attitudes toward immigration.
This is really a major question about how democracies work, right? Should uninformed opinions drive policy? Or should opinions that are demonstrably wrong drive policy? I mean, frankly, Matt, you're the Democratic theorist. That's a very important question. So, I mean, the work that we've done here does show some economic effects, but they're not particularly strong. And again, those are all perceptions of economic effects, not necessarily actual economic effects. I mean, you've laid out a very rational basis for the policy to give children of undocumented immigrants access to colleges and universities. I'm not sure that everyone agrees with that, and so the question is, whose views should prevail? I mean, you've laid this. Maybe you should do a commercial or something that convince people of the value of that particular way. But one of the questions is how people respond to that. I mean, one of the other things I study is political knowledge, and there are a lot of people who don't really have much of an understanding of all kinds of political issues yet. We have to, they participate in the electoral system and make decisions.
What effect does language have on immigration?
That's a great question.
For example, my family was Italian. I'm second generation. My grandparents spoke no English.
Right.
All of their children learned English. No one spoke Italian in the home except to speak to the parents.
Right.
Assimilation was everything. And apparently, from what you indicated, assimilation does work.
Yeah.
It seems like the Hispanic community has but Italian immigration ceased in the 20s, and so you had that generation dying off.
Right.
What effect does the fact that the Hispanic community continued to come in make that as important or less important?
You know, the one thing I'm kicking myself over is in looking at the language in which the interview was conducted. I think almost all these interviews may have been conducted in English, or there may have been some in Spanish, but I don't know that there's a variable in that. And many surveys will ask, what language do you speak in your home regularly? And they'll ask, do you speak English only, your Spanish only, or whatever the native language is, or a combination of both. And I work with a large number of Latino and Asian students, and it's a common thing that we talk about. Well, my father, for instance, his first language was French. He spoke French until he was 10, and then switched to English. And my grandmother, we would go visit my grandmother, and she would speak in French. But my father never spoke French around the house. So therefore, I went to an international conference that was in English, and they asked if they could speak in French, and I was the only person at the conference who didn't know French, and my father spoke French. I mean, I was terribly embarrassed by that. But the fact is, you'd have these various pressures, and of course, in some areas of the country, people were openly discouraged from speaking their native language. There are people in Louisiana, which of course has a large French heritage. There are people who tell stories that they were discouraged from speaking French in public schools, and so I think language is a connector, and I don't. Unfortunately, we don't have the data in the survey to really explore that further. That's a great question, though.
On the way back.
Like what region, or just in general, what population was used for the survey?
This is a national survey, and so it covers the entire nation. So we can differentiate what place people are from. The one thing we have not included in this survey is data on the context that people live in. So like if you live in an area that has a large Latino population, does that change any of this? And we have not gotten to that analysis yet. We do have the geographic codes so that we can merge that kind of information in there, but this is a national survey of 1,300 Americans.
It would be interesting to see if you had that differentiation, border states.
I know. Well, the one other thing is the American National Election Survey does large oversamples of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, and unfortunately, because we were paying for this on our own, we couldn't do those large oversamples, which is why I'm hoping the American National Election Survey will agree to add some of our questions to their survey, because they do these large oversamples. And one of the things that I've done some work on how Latinos think about immigration, and it's very interesting to look. There are real differences in when you study an issue like immigration across these various groups. And so.
Next, sir, in the red.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for being neutrality and speaking something about data. A lot of the questions were more about how Americans think about this, how Americans think about that. For example, on the issue of welfare.
Yep.
On the issue of welfare, you said there was a connection, the immigrantization of welfare.
Immigrationalization of how Americans think about welfare.
About welfare. So, on issues about that, or issues of even like border security. For example, do you believe that if Americans didn't think, but rather knew how immigrants stood on issues of that sort, do you think that would switch some of the partisan political strategies, for example, in some of these elections?
That's a great question. One of the problems is that when we're doing a survey, people come into the survey with their own experiences and their own ideas about this, and so we can ask them about those experiences and ideas if we have a chance to ask those kinds of questions. But there's some research that's been done that uses experiments where people actually manipulate information that people get. Because your real question is about if people knew about things. Yeah, if they actually knew about things, would that change how they think? Well, in a survey like this, we can't really do that very well. But in an experimental design, I can, for instance, randomly assign some people to a story where they get they read a news story about, let's say, immigrant gangs, so that portrays immigrants in a negative way. In another news story, they portray the hardworking immigrant who comes here and is working 2 jobs and is doing the best to raise his or her children, etc. Well, those are 2 framing of immigration in a different way. The first one would probably inspire negative views, whereas the second one would inspire more positive views. And this is why I think studying how the media covers this is very important. The problem is, I wish everyone knew everything about everything. The problem, but in American society, there's a lot of, there are quite a few people who are not aware of the issues, but nonetheless, they still are voters and still can register their opinions.
So somebody that knows everything about everything is Matt Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
You're up.
But I try to give everybody else a chance. So I have a question here about the direction of causality on one of the factors that you identify and what purchase you have on that, either methodologically or theoretically. And that is this question of the relationship between perceived ideological distance and affect towards the immigrant group. Because the story that you tell is that I think that illegal immigrants are ideologically distant from me,
Right.
and therefore I decide that I don't like them.
Right.
But of course it's equally plausible that it's the other way around, right? That is that I initially decide I don't like illegal immigrants, and of course a lot of psychological theory would say that if I have a disliked attitude object, I will tend to exaggerate its distance from me on all kinds of variables. So how is there a way to sort out between those 2 competing explanations?
I mean, this gets into some real methodological weeds, and I will tell you, this is an issue that I know we're going to have to confront at some point in the process. We've already thought about it, but we've not done anything with it yet, because these are sort of kind of preliminary findings. When we did the welfare immigration paper, one of the responses by reviewers was that it may be that how Americans think about welfare affects their views towards immigration. So we did instrumental variables, two-stage least squares model to dismiss that, and we found that the effect still existed. In this case, we're going to have to do that, but of course the task is to find appropriate instruments and all that. So that's going to be something we're going to work on. Because we would really need variables that are related to one but not to the other, and so we're going to have to think through that. But I think that's a very plausible thing. And of course, there's this psychological tendency for people to view themselves also as more moderate than they are. We're seeing this when I'm working with an undergrad student on the African American, Asian, Hispanic items. And you see, for instance, that if you ask African Americans where they perceive themselves ideologically, they see themselves as moderate. But when you ask every other group how they view African Americans, whites, Asians, and Hispanics, those groups all see African Americans as more to the left. So it's interesting to see these perceptual differences, and I'm sure there's something in there going on.
One thing that would, I think, give some interesting leverage on this question is if you had some reasonably objective measure about what the ideological orientation of illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants really is. Right? So if we could see, when people say they're more to the left, are they correct about that? Or is that some sort of projection that's going on?
Well, for instance, in the survey, there is a citizenship question. So we can differentiate immigrants as being citizens and non-citizens. But the fact that someone's not a citizen doesn't mean that they're undocumented. It may be that they're a documented non-citizen. And plus, the numbers of them are so small.
Well, and plus, undocumented are going to be way underrepresented in the survey because they're not going to.
Yeah, for instance, the estimates that we gave on the undocumented over time, what they do with that is they actually add 10% because they estimate that the number of people who underreport their lack of documented status is it's higher than it actually is reported.
In the back, please.
The polls were about the perceptions of Hispanics and Asians and how they're perceived with the economy and I guess household income. There were no polls on the Syrian refugees and their perception, American people's perception on terror. Do you think that would have similar perceptions or any different, or do you plan on doing polls?
I gotta tell you, these are the best questions I've had when I've given a presentation. Really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have any data in the current survey. It was done in 2014, and the Syrian issue really has occurred since. But you're asking me to speculate about it, and I think that there may be some similarities. Because what is the concern about Syrian refugees? It's a security concern, right? And that's based on perception. Now, we know that there are, if the stories about what happened in France are correct, we know that there was at least some Syrian refugees who participated in the terrorist act. But when you look at risk, the probability, how many Syrian refugees are potential terrorists? Is it 0.003%, right? So connecting objective reality about risk and sort of subjective assessments of that risk would be really interesting to study in a survey. And I suspect that there's some people who are interested in how Americans view Muslims and have done some surveys to deal with that. So I suspect those researchers are doing something about the Syrian refugee crisis. But I think that a similar process may be at work, but we have to actually look at the data.
Thank you. This has been so helpful. I'm wondering if most of the findings you've presented on these slides have already been published somewhere, where I could go access it.
No, but I am happy to make these slides available to anyone who's interested in it by writing to me, and I can give you my email address.
Really?
Or whatever.
Great. Thank
I'm
you.
happy to share that, as long as you don't publish it yourself. And this is a paper. This is a part of a paper that I'm presenting at the Midwest Political Science meeting in April. So I will have an actual paper with text instead of just figures. And this is going to be a series of papers that we're working on this year, and I'm happy to share anything that I write. So I'm happy to give you my email address if you want to write about that. So
What is it quickly, your email address?
it's Pogara. That's Pogara at lsu.edu. Pogara at lsu.edu. And you can find my email address on the LSU Political Science website if you can.
And the Tower Center can put you on.
Yeah, correct. And Matt, a bunch of people here know me, so I have my email address, Lisa or Matt or someone else. Ray.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And again, it is a beautiful day outside, but there was a lot to learn inside. So thank you for joining us, and join me in thanking our wonderful